The moment I saw the barrel of the pistol shaking in Gwendolyn Vance's liver-spotted hand, I knew two things. One, my HOA president had finally lost her damn mind. And two, she was going down. It started earlier that morning. I'd just gotten home from a night shift at the hospital, 12 hours on my feet, 3 code blues, and one guy who tried to bite me because he didn't want to wait for a tetanus shot. All I wanted was a hot shower, a cold beer, and to collapse face first into my couch. But instead, I found a bright orange envelope duct taped to my front door, fluttering like a warning flag in the breeze. Another fine. This time, lawn noncompliance. Grass height exceeds HOA regulation by 1.5 inches. The kicker? I'd mowed it 2 days ago. They even included a photo that looked like it had been taken with a microwave, all blurry and tilted like someone had leaned out of a golf cart mid-swerve. I tore it open, and there it was, another fee. $800. That made it over $5,000 in violations this year. And I'd paid every one of them up until last month when I finally decided enough was enough. I wasn't about to let a retired substitute teacher with a superiority complex and a clipboard bankrupt me over crabgrass and a mailbox that wasn't aesthetically aligned. I stormed down to the HOA office, which was basically a converted garage at the end of the cul-de-sac. Gwendolyn Vance was already waiting inside, sipping iced tea with a slice of lemon floating like a smug little life raft. "Frederick," she said when I stepped inside, her voice sugar-coated but sharp enough to cut through bone. "We were just discussing your persistent negligence." "Cut the crap, Gwen," I snapped, slapping the notice on her desk. "You photoshopped this. That's my neighbor's lawn." She didn't even blink. "It's your property line. And your responsibility. If you don't pay the balance by Friday, we'll be placing a lien on your home. You can't place a lien without a court order." "Oh, we can," she said, reaching into her desk drawer. "It's all in the bylaws. Page 43. You should really take the time to read them." Then she pulled out the gun. It wasn't subtle. A silver revolver, gleaming under the fluorescent lights like something out of a Western. She set it on the desk, not pointing it directly at me, but not exactly away either. Her withered hand rested on it lightly, like she was petting a cat. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be," she said. "Pay the fees, and we forget this happened." I stared at her. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm advising you," she said sweetly. "For your own safety." I left. Slowly. Hands visible. Heart pounding. As soon as I stepped outside, I ducked behind the hedge and called a buddy of mine from high school, now a detective in the county sheriff's office. "Frank," he said when he picked up, "please tell me you're not calling because of that HOA circus again." "She pulled a gun on me, Rob," I whispered. She laid it on the desk like it was a stapler. He went silent for a second. "You sure?" "I know a Colt python when I see one." Then he said the words that shifted everything. "Stay out of sight. I'm making some calls." Turns out, this wasn't the first time Gwendolyn had crossed the line, but it was the first time someone caught her with solid evidence. And I had more than that. I had my body cam footage. See, a few weeks back, after the third bogus fine in a row, I'd started wearing a discreet button cam when dealing with the HOA. Just in case. I emailed it to Rob. 2 hours later, a full tactical team in unmarked vans rolled into the neighborhood like a silent storm. I watched from my upstairs window as SWAT officers fanned out from the vehicles, weapons drawn, moving toward the HOA building. Gwendolyn's little golf cart was parked out front, the American flag flapping behind it like a joke. They breached the door in seconds. I heard the crash, then shouting, then the satisfying sound of someone screaming, "Get on the ground." When they brought her out in cuffs, she was still wearing that ridiculous sun visor and a pink tracksuit that said HOA President across the back in rhinestones. Her mouth was flapping, trying to spin it all as a misunderstanding, probably blaming me for everything under the sun. But it was too late. They found the gun. They found files. And they found something else. A safe hidden behind a fake panel in the wall stuffed with cash, dozens of signed checks from residents, and a ledger that read more like a mob book than homeowner records. She'd been skimming fines for years. Thousands missing from the community fund. Fake landscaping contracts with shell companies. One of them was registered to her nephew in Idaho. And just like that, the woman who once fined a single mom for hanging a beach towel on her balcony was being shoved into the back of a squad car, facing charges ranging from extortion to armed intimidation. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because as satisfying as it was to see her hauled away, I knew Gwendolyn Vance wasn't working alone. The HOA board had 5 members. and they hadn't made a peep. The day after the raid, the neighborhood looked like someone had yanked the lid off a pressure cooker. People were standing in driveways, huddled in front yards, murmuring in tight circles like survivors of a shared trauma. News vans had shown up by mid-morning, their satellite dishes rising like mechanical sunflowers. Channel 6 had a camera crew parked near the HOA building, and a reporter in a blue blazer was already interviewing a dog walker whose voice kept cracking from excitement. I sat on my porch steps, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching the circus roll in. My phone had been buzzing nonstop, not just from neighbors, but from people I hadn't heard from in years. Apparently, someone had leaked the body cam footage to a local watchdog blog, and it had gone viral before breakfast. The clip of Gwendolyn tapping the revolver like it was a paperweight had already racked up over 70,000 views. Around noon, a black SUV pulled up in front of my house. Rob stepped out, still in plain clothes, flashing his badge just long enough to quiet the neighbors. He didn't knock, just walked up and sat down beside me like we were back in high school, killing time before football practice. "You're not gonna like this," he said after a beat. I didn't answer. I just raised an eyebrow. We recovered the ledger. "It's bad, Fred." She wasn't working solo. The other board members signed off on a lot of the withdrawals. "Some of the checks in the safe? Co-signed by your treasurer and secretary. And there's more." He pulled a folded sheet of legal paper from his jacket and handed it over. It was a subpoena. My name was printed clearly near the bottom. "You're a key witness now," he said. "They're calling it a racketeering case. Mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, unlawful intimidation, possibly even money laundering, depending on how far the shell accounts go." I stared at the paper, then him. "This is going to blow the whole board apart, isn't it?" "Already has," he said. "Your vice president tried to get on a plane to Arizona 3 hours after the raid. TSA flagged her. She's in custody." Treasurer's lawyered up. "And the secretary?" "She tried to delete the HOA's entire digital record system. IT team recovered most of it, but she's looking at obstruction." I let out a low whistle. "What about the contractor names in the files?" He nodded grimly. "Half of them don't exist. The other half are cousins, nephews, or ex-spouses. They filed work orders for repairs that were never done. You ever wonder why that fountain at the front entrance was under restoration for 2 years? I didn't need to respond. We both knew the answer. Later that afternoon, a town hall was announced not by the board, who were either in jail, hiding, or lawyered up, but by a group of residents who decided they'd had enough. They set it up in the community clubhouse, the same space the HOA used to host their mandatory compliance workshops, that always felt more like a courtroom than a meeting. I arrived just as the place was filling up. Folding chairs scraped against tile, and a whiteboard stood at the front with Emergency Community Forum scrawled across it in red marker. Nobody was in charge, but somehow it still felt more organized than anything the HOA had ever thrown together. An older woman named Mrs. Calhoun, who lived 2 streets over and had once been fined for planting sunflowers instead of begonias, took the lead. "We've all been played," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "But we're not helpless. We can take control of our own neighborhood. There's precedent for this." People leaned forward. A man near the back asked how, and she explained. Under state law, if a majority of homeowners voted to dissolve the existing HOA structure due to criminal activity, they could petition the county to revoke the board's authority and establish a temporary oversight committee until new elections could be held. "We already have grounds," she said, "and we only need 60% of homeowners to sign." They passed out clipboards. People signed fast. By the end of the night, they had over 70%. The following morning, I got a knock on my door. Not a cop this time. It was Linda, who lived across from me, holding out a manila envelope. "I found this in my mailbox last week," she said. "Didn't think much of it until the raid. It's from one of Gwendolyn's former assistants. Looks like she'd been keeping records." I opened it. Inside were printed emails, hundreds of them between board members. Some were routine, scheduling, vendor updates, meeting reminders. But others? They were damning. Lines like, "Make sure we flag the Johnsons for a fine next month, they still haven't paid the last one," and "Let's target the homes on the north end for citations. We need extra funds before Q3. They were using fines as a revenue stream, not to enforce rules, to fund their own projects and skim off the top. One thread even referenced a plan to rezone a stretch of green space into private storage units, with the profits funneled through a holding company registered in Nevada. That was county property. They hadn't even started the paperwork, just assumed no one would notice. I forwarded everything to Rob. For days later, federal investigators filed charges. The assistant who'd leaked the emails was granted immunity. Gwendolyn was transferred to county lockup to await trial. The other board members were indicted. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen, and a forensic audit was underway. Meanwhile, the neighborhood transformed. Without the board breathing down our necks, people came out of hiding. Kids were riding bikes again. Someone painted a mural on the side of the maintenance shed, and no one tore it down. A few neighbors strung up solar lights in their trees, and instead of violation notices, they got compliments. The temporary oversight committee was voted in unanimously. I was asked to join. I almost declined after everything. I just wanted peace, but then I remembered how close they'd come to stealing this place from everyone who lived here. So I said yes. At our first official meeting, we passed a motion to audit every contract the HOA had signed in the last 5 years. We hired a real accounting firm, not someone's cousin, to trace the missing money. And we made every budget document public, transparent, accessible. No more secret fines. No more backroom deals. As we adjourned, Mrs. Calhoun leaned over to me. "You know," she said with a half-smile, "if you hadn't worn that camera, we'd still be in the dark." I shrugged. Just wanted proof. I didn't think it'd take down a criminal empire. "Well," she said, "sometimes it only takes one well-lit truth to burn the whole rotten thing down." I walked home under a sky that looked clearer than it had in weeks. Not because the clouds were gone, because the fear was. 3 weeks after the arrests, the clubhouse still smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cheap air freshener, but now it felt like it belonged to the residents again. We'd replaced the old framed HOA mission statement written in bold serif font and filled with phrases like civic compliance and aesthetic harmony, with a corkboard covered in pinned suggestions from neighbors. Someone had even stuck a Polaroid of Gwendolyn being escorted into the police van, captioned in marker, "Crime doesn't pay, but she sure tried." That morning, I sat at a folding table with the interim committee, sorting through a pile of archival files we'd pulled from the HOA's off-site storage unit. Half of it was junk duplicate invoices, expired flyers for HOA bake sales, and one bizarre folder labeled Fence Uniformity Prioritization Schedule. But buried halfway through the stack, Linda found a manila envelope with no label. Inside were property surveys. Dozens of them. And not just from our subdivision. "These aren't all ours," she said, spreading them out. "This one here? That's from Glenberry Heights." I leaned over. She was right. I recognized the name. Glenberry Heights was a community 4 miles north, outside our HOA's jurisdiction. We kept going. There were documents from 5 other subdivisions, all stamped with the same signature, Gwendolyn Vance. Rob showed up an hour later. I handed him one of the surveys and pointed to the signature. His expression hardened instantly. "She was acquiring property rights outside her authority," he said. "That's fraud, Fred. Serious fraud." We followed him outside where he made a phone call from the sidewalk. I couldn't hear much, but he ended it with, "Yep, we'll need federal oversight on this." 2 days later, the FBI showed up. They weren't flashy. No black vans, no windbreakers. Just 2 agents in plain suits who showed their badges and requested the files. I handed over everything. The older one thumbed through the stack, stopping on a page marked Maintenance Allocation Project A. "This isn't just overreach," he said. "This is coordinated. There's a pattern here." He didn't have to explain. I could already see it. Gwendolyn hadn't just been padding fines or faking contracts. She'd been orchestrating a land acquisition scheme, using HOA fines and intimidation to push out homeowners, then quietly purchasing properties through shell entities. The paper trail led to a trust registered in Delaware. Innocuous on paper, but Rob later confirmed it linked back to a firm in Tampa that specialized in quiet acquisitions of aging neighborhoods for redevelopment. Gwendolyn had been slowly flipping properties, using the HOA as a chokehold to force sales, then reselling them to developers under the radar. It wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. The FBI opened a formal investigation into interstate real estate fraud. That meant subpoenas, federal prosecutors, and eventually a grand jury. Meanwhile, the fallout in our neighborhood was spreading. Lily, the woman 2 doors down who'd always kept her yard immaculate, discovered that her property line had been quietly redrawn in a fake survey 2 years ago. She'd been paying taxes on land that technically didn't belong to her anymore. I don't even know who owns my backyard, she whispered at a committee meeting, her hands shaking as she held up the county plat map. She wasn't alone. At least 11 homes had been affected, their legal boundaries tampered with. Some had been rezoned. Others had liens placed through forged paperwork. We brought in a real estate attorney pro bono, thanks to a local law school clinic, and he confirmed the worst. The HOA had filed unauthorized amendments to the original development charter with the county recorder's office. They used a loophole, he said. They submitted changes in bulk, claiming unanimous consent from the board and a supermajority vote from residents. None of that happened. He laid out a strategy, petitioned the court to nullify the amendments, file civil claims for damages, and request a full forensic title review of all affected properties. The temporary committee voted unanimously to proceed. That same week, I got a call from Rob. They're indicting her, he said. Federal charges this time. Real estate fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and something else. I waited. They're charging her with criminal racketeering under RICO. That hit like a drop of scalding water. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act was no joke. It was designed to dismantle organized crime syndicates. If Gwendolyn was being charged under RICO, it meant the feds weren't buying the rogue HOA president angle anymore. They believed this was a structured, ongoing criminal enterprise. And the best part? RICO allowed for asset forfeiture. That meant every dollar she'd skimmed, every house she'd flipped, every dime stashed in offshore accounts, the government could seize it all. By the end of the month, we learned that 3 other HOA boards in neighboring communities had been involved. Gwendolyn wasn't just the ringleader here, she was part of a multi-county network of corrupt HOA executives using the same playbook. They called it the compliance cartel. The media exploded. Local stations ran exposés. National outlets picked it up. There were interviews with whistleblowers, angry residents from other neighborhoods, and real estate experts who explained how the scam had worked for years because no one thought to challenge community leadership. One night, I was watching it unfold on TV when there was a knock at my door. It was Rob, holding a folder. They're going to ask you to testify, he said. Not just about the gun. About everything. The fines, the manipulation, the threats. You're the first one who pushed back. The one with the footage. I nodded. I'll do it. He hesitated, then handed me the folder. This is sealed, but you'll see it eventually. You need to know what was coming next. I opened it. Inside were internal emails dated just 2 days before the raid. One of them laid out plans for a special assessment fee targeting non-compliant residents. The proposed amount? $25,000 per household. The justification? Neighborhood Revitalization Initiative. They were going to bankrupt us. Legally. Slowly. Until we either paid or walked away. They were weeks away from filing, Rob said. You stopped it just in time. The grand jury convened in early spring. I testified under oath, laying out everything I'd witnessed. The fraudulent notices. The intimidation. The weapon. The tampered surveys. The false financials. I handed over my footage, my notes, the envelope Linda had given me, and the stack of resident testimonies we collected. By the time the jury was done, 32 indictments had been handed down across 4 counties. The Fed seized 10 properties, froze 6 bank accounts, and placed a court order halting all HOA operations in the affected communities. Back home, things were different now. The interim committee transitioned into an elected residents' council. We created a public ledger of every neighborhood expense. We voted on projects. We held open forums. And most importantly, we passed a new charter, one that guaranteed no resident could ever be fined, cited, or penalized without a public vote and documented due process. The old HOA building? We converted it into a co-op space for local small businesses. A bakery opened in the front half. The back became a community legal resource center. One afternoon, I found myself walking past it with Linda. She paused, looking up at the faded paint on the side of the building. Funny, isn't it? She said. How something that used to scare people now smells like fresh bread. I nodded. That's what happens when you take power away from the wrong people and give it back to the right ones. We kept walking. The sun dipped low, casting a warm amber glow across the rooftops. Kids were chalking the sidewalks. Someone was grilling 2 houses over. A couple sat on their porch, laughing over iced tea. It wasn't perfect, but it was finally ours. The first sign that the fallout wasn't over came on a gray Tuesday morning, 2 months after the grand jury handed down the final indictments. A thin mist clung to the streets like condensation on glass, and the neighborhood had settled into a cautious kind of peace. People were fixing up neglected yards, repainting porches, even organizing block dinners. But beneath the surface, tension lingered in the corners, like everyone was waiting for a shoe that hadn't quite dropped. I was on my third cup of coffee when I noticed the unfamiliar car parked across the street. Dark green sedan, government plates, engine still ticking. 2 men inside. Not local cops, these guys had the posture of people who didn't knock unless they had something heavy in their back pockets. An hour later, I heard the knock. It was crisp, not urgent. I opened the door and met the eyes of a tall, hard-faced man with a thin scar running from his temple to the curve of his jaw. His badge was already out, and behind him stood a shorter agent with a notepad already open. "Mr. Frederick Harris?" the tall one asked. I nodded. "Special Agent Neely, Office of Inspector General. This is Agent Kolinsky. We'd like a few minutes of your time. Inside, if possible." I stepped aside. They walked in like men who weren't used to being told no. "We're following up on a matter involving procurement fraud," Neely said, settling into the kitchen chair I pointed to. "Our office was flagged after your HOA's financial records were cross-referenced with several federal grant disbursements. That caught me off guard." "You're saying they were getting federal money?" Kolinsky nodded. "Community beautification grants, disaster resilience funds, even an urban development subsidy meant for low-income revitalization, all processed through the Department of Housing and Urban Development." I leaned against the counter. "We're not a low-income neighborhood." "No, you're not," Neely said flatly. "But someone claimed you were." He pulled a folder from his briefcase and passed it to me. Inside were copies of grant applications submitted under our HOA's name. The documents were dense, full of boilerplate language about underserved populations and critical infrastructure. But buried in the appendices were forged census maps, manipulated income statistics, and falsified utility data, all designed to make our neighborhood look like a crumbling inner-city block instead of a mid-range suburban cul-de-sac. They applied for these under a shell nonprofit called the Community Renewal Alliance, Kolinsky explained, flipping to a page listing board members. "Recognize any names?" I did. Every one of them had been on the HOA board at some point over the last 5 years. One of the names, a man I'd never met, was listed as the organization's founder. A quick check revealed he didn't exist. They created a ghost president to anchor the paperwork. "Where did the money go?" I asked. Neely's lips tightened. "Private accounts. Off-books contractors. One supposedly built a stormwater drainage system in the greenbelt behind Lot 17. We checked. The greenbelt's been untouched since it was planted. No drainage, no construction, no permits filed with the county." "How much are we talking?" I asked. "Across all applications?" Kolinsky said. "North of $6 million. I sat down. My knees weren't cooperating. "We need your help, Mr. Harris," Neely said gently. "Your footage, your testimony." It cracked the door open. "But this is the core of it. This isn't just a rogue HOA anymore. This is federal theft. And someone still out there is trying to cover their tracks." "You think someone's still operating?" I asked. Neely looked at Kolinsky, then back at me. "We think someone's trying to destroy the remaining evidence, and we're concerned they might be from inside the county records office." That night, the Oversight Committee held an emergency meeting in the newly renovated community center. The bakery up front was closed for the evening, but the scent of cinnamon still hung in the air. Mrs. Calhoun was already waiting when I arrived, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I told them everything. The ghost nonprofit, the forged data, the $6 million siphoned off under phony development claims. The possibility that someone inside our own county was helping cover it up. "What do we do?" one of the newer members, a guy named Paolo, asked. He was a plumber by trade, not used to dealing with anything more sinister than a corroded pipe. "We find the files," I said. "The ones that haven't been tampered with yet." "We already turned over everything," Linda pointed out. "Not quite," I said. "There's one more place we haven't looked." Every HOA had storage. Ours had 3 units. We'd already gone through the main one behind the clubhouse and another that had been leased under the HOA's name in a nearby facility. But the third? It was listed under the name of a landscaping company that hadn't existed since 2009. We found the unit late the next day. It was in a rundown facility behind a defunct strip mall, the kind of place where the fluorescent lights flickered and the keypad on the gate had duct tape over the numbers. The unit was jammed behind a row of rusted trailers. Inside, it was packed. Not with junk, but with bankers' boxes, all neatly labeled in black marker. June 2017 Finance. Contractor Correspondence. Infrastructure Bids 2019. Hundreds of boxes, and every one untouched. We called Neely. Within hours, the place was crawling with federal agents. They set up under pop-up tents, scanning files, boxing evidence. A mobile forensics van pulled in by sundown. Kolinsky handed me a bottle of water and a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. You just handed us the spine of the whole operation. 3 days later, arrests were made in the county clerk's office. 2 employees, both middle management, had been falsifying document timestamps and backdating permits to cover the HOA's tracks. One had even created dummy inspection reports for non-existent projects. The final blow came when the IRS joined the investigation. Turns out, the board had been funneling money not just through shell vendors, but through fake charitable donations. They created a scholarship fund that had never awarded a single scholarship. The listed recipients? Fake students. The bank account? Tied to a debit card used to purchase a luxury timeshare in Aspen. Gwendolyn was hit with additional charges: federal tax fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Her lawyer tried to negotiate a plea, but the prosecutors weren't interested. She was sentenced to 27 years without parole. The others followed. Some got 10, 15, depending on their level of involvement. A few turned state's evidence and were given reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. The county officials were fired. One pled guilty. The other fled the state and was picked up in Oregon after trying to cross into Canada with a fake passport. The Community Renewal Alliance was dissolved. Its assets seized. The $6 million? Traced, reclaimed, and earmarked for restitution. Our neighborhood got a chunk of it back. The rest went to a grant fund for neighborhoods that had been targeted by similar scams. A real one this time, with oversight. When it all finally settled, and the last courtroom door had closed behind the last guilty party, I stood outside the community center with Mrs. Calhoun and Linda. The air was cool, steady. The streetlights hummed gently. They thought we'd fold, Linda said. They thought we wouldn't notice, Mrs. Calhoun added. They didn't count on us getting organized, I said. The next morning, I took down the last of the old HOA signs. The ones that used to line the entryway, warning of fines, compliance checks, and mandatory inspections. I loaded them into the back of my truck and drove them to the scrapyard. They paid me $22 in cash. I donated it to the Community Mural Fund. The new sign at the neighborhood entrance went up the following week. Simple, clean, and clear. Welcome to Meadowbrook. Resident-owned. Resident-led. No threats. No warnings. Just home.